Hello, and welcome to AI Curious. My name is Jeff Wilser. I'm a journalist, I'm a human, and I am curious about AI. And I am very curious about AI and robotics, especially given some crazy timing here. Just literally a day or two ago, there was a big announcement in the AI world. Boston Dynamics unveiled a new robot called Atlas that's equal parts exciting and terrifying. The video they showed has this kind of legit Terminator looking robot kind of on the floor, crumpled up. And then he kind of menacingly stands up and swivels toward the camera. I mean, it all but screams like, I need a weapon now to continue my mission. Kind of a wild choice for the overall vibe. But point is, there are massive strides being made right now in the world of humanoid robotics. Tesla recently unveiled their latest generation of their robot project, Optimus, and Elon Musk recently said he expects robots to eventually overtake cars as Tesla's main product. And he thought the demand could easily be 10 to 20 billion units. And of course, Elon is notorious for making predictions, many of which don't come out, but still, the point is there is energy in this space. Here to talk all things robots is Kordel France, the founder and lead engineer of an AI and robotics startup called Theta, which is doing a variety of cool things in AI, including focusing on the overlooked role of the sense of smell. They have a whole olfactory division that's experimenting with this in surprising ways that could have specific use cases now and also could kind of add to the mix of AGI and make an ultimate AGI more robust by incorporating smell in addition to text, image, sound, and so on. Kordel and I get into all of that, but first we go deep into where robotics are today, where they're going, and whether they will truly get mainstream in the next 10 years. Kordel thinks that's quite likely and possibly even sooner than 10 years. And there's a very good chance that consumer robots, like humanoid robots, will become a must-have appliance. Kind of like how most people now have their laptop, their phone, and in most of the country besides like New York and LA and San Francisco, people have cars, right? So that might be the new world 10 years from now. You have your phone, your computer, and your robot. For many, this is kind of terrifying, the idea of robots everywhere, but it's also undeniably interesting, at least to me. So I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Kordel France, a robot expert and founder and lead engineer of Theta. Kordel, welcome to the pod.
Jeff, thanks for having me. Excited to be on.
Let's start with the state of play of robotics, a subject I am super excited by. So, where are we today? What can robots do? What can they not do? Every once in a while, I'll see like YouTube videos of a Optimus demonstration from Tesla, right? And you see a case, you see like really incredible things like, oh, wow, it could now, I'm making this up, but it can draw with a pencil. It's hard to know though, if that's just a kind of this on display thing it does on a stage. How close is that ready for prime time, right? So how would you characterize where these humanoid robots are and what they can do, and like how many months or years until they'll actually be able to do things in our lives, like clean our toilets or make us breakfast, things like that?
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. I think that robotics right now, we're especially like with respect to humanoid robotics, because that's since you mentioned the Optimus bot and everything, I think they're basically solving that 80% of test cases, right? That 80% of scenarios that humans can handle, right? But what happens if you break your finger? Well, most humans can still write, maybe not that legibly, but they can still handle these things, these corner cases, if you will. And so I think a lot of the robotics companies right now are going through the same thing that self-driving was going through 5 years ago, right, or a couple years ago, where it's trying to master just the base 80% of cases in which will be used. It's hard because with AI, you can train a model to generalize pretty well to other domains, but once you start putting hardware into the mix of things, it makes everything really, really, really difficult. It magnifies the order of problems, right? Hardware is always a magnifier for how many degrees of freedom the problem actually has. And so I think companies are dealing a lot with that right now. The other interesting thing is if we're what I originally thought a few years ago was that we were going to force the world to adapt to robotics, but I think we're forcing robotics to adapt to the world in a human sense. So what I mean by that is like a Roomba isn't manifested in a humanoid form, right? It can clean the
Hmm.
floor and it does so very, very well. But it's doesn't have fingers, doesn't have hands, doesn't have anything. Self-driving cars, I thought we were gonna have to put line like certain lane markings in the road just for self-driving cars, right? So they understood how to manipulate in through the world. But we're making those robots adapt to humans. We put all 5 fingers. I mean, a lot of these companies are putting 5 fingers on humanoid robots on each hand, and self-driving cars are learning to just drive through vision, right, and a little bit of lidar.
Hmm.
But I mean, Tesla, their philosophy was humans drive with 2 cameras on a gimbal, and so we're going to force the cars to drive with multiple cameras, right? We're only using vision. So that's been really interesting because it's yeah, instead of making the world adapt to robotics, we're forcing robotics to adapt to the human world, which has been really cool to see because it's magnified the problem a bit, right? Because humans handle a lot of different corner cases that we've spoken about. But it's also kind of been an interesting journey to see, like, wow, how do we really replicate all of these different features and capabilities that humans have into a machine form?
Interesting. And yeah, I'm glad you mentioned and made a distinction between humanoid robots and then things like Roomba. Um, let's unpack that a little more. When we say robots in robotics, what are we generally talking about? Or, and tackle this however you like, what are the main buckets of robots out there? And where's most of the energy, right? So most of the companies out there, I'm curious about your own company. What types of robots are most building? Is it mostly humanoid robots like the Optimus, with occasionally companies doing things like, all right, here's a specialized cleaning robot that might look like a toaster, or here's a robot for spraying windows and it's like more like a drone, right? Where is the energy in the space when it comes to robotics?
The biggest trends I've seen so far right now are obviously in generative AI, right, which is maybe not necessarily on the robotics side, but it will feed into robotics, and then the humanoid robotics form. And again, there's been so much investment in the space, right, between with humanoid robotics, because I feel like there's been some simultaneous breakthroughs with energy management. With I mean, because that's robotics in general are a huge energy computational problem. Computer speed, right? Sensor processing, all these things just getting small enough and compact enough that you can put them into a mobile form that's actually practical for a machine to use. Um, I think has been a really interesting thing to see. Um, but you really have to ask yourself, like, what is a robot, right? And what is AI? And it's really hard to define that, in my opinion, because multiple people have different things or different opinions on what intelligence really is. So
Hmm.
it's like how do you define consciousness? Is something intelligent if it's not conscious, right? If I have a robot or an AI that completely replicates a dog, would we say that's not intelligent? I mean, I wouldn't. I would say that's pretty intelligent, right? It's not human intelligence, but it's a different intelligence. And so there's a lot of different avenues that you could go down in different camps of thinking on what AI and robotics really is. But to me, I'd classify a robot that is anything that can automate a procedure that uses both software intelligence and hardware intelligence. So it's got basically psychology, so some
Hmm.
software, and it's got actuators, sensors throughout the world that allows it to actually engage with the world. Um, like ChatGPT, I wouldn't necessarily classify that as a robot because it doesn't have sensors to go out
Right.
and
It has no arms or legs. It's just a facsimile of a brain, and obviously they're getting closer and closer to acting more brain-like. But there's a brain but no body. And then, if I hear your framework correctly, conversely, like decades ago, when like Ford was cranking out quote unquote robots on an assembly line to like just screw in bolts and engines in a car, they might have called that a robot, but it's really more machine. It's not a robot in the sense of there's no software, there's no even surrogate of a mind. It's not, there's no decisions being made, there's no programming beyond just like screw in light bulb, right? So it's almost like you need a combination of some kind of physical hardware and also something that is on the continuum path towards sentience. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. It's, and I think the definition of robotics and AI has changed throughout the course of the last few decades. Because, I mean, for example, like machine learning, when I was in school, was classified as like different regression algorithms. So basically, advanced statistical models. Now, today, it would be classified as just statistics, right? So I think we've
Hmm.
moved the needle of like what's a robot, what's intelligence, what's AI, what's sentience, kind of a thing. Um, I mean, yeah, like to your point, those assembly line robotics or assembly line machines, those are incredibly intelligent and they can handle a lot of things, but it's a very, very scoped task and it's very structured. So maybe back then it was a cutting edge robot. Maybe today we classify more of that as just like a machine. Again, there's different camps of thought here, but it really is it really kind of it really begs the question of we need to define what robotics and AI are because at some point we're going to build general artificial intelligence, and how are we going to classify we're here, right? I don't think it's going to be like a subtle thing or like a sharp peak where it's like, oh wow, today we have AGI, cool. I think it's going to be a gradual slope, and it's like when or how do we know when we're there?
Right. Well, we'll go there eventually. I'm very curious about what I'm going to call the data, like from Star Trek scenario. Right. When do
Yeah.
we when we fuse something that kind of looks sort of like AGI with an actual humanoid robot that looks kind of sort of like a human, we're in very great territory. So we'll get there in a bit. Before we go there, what's your take of what types of things robots will be able to do for us in a mainstream way, let's say in the next decade? And let me give you a little context of why I asked that question. I recently had a podcast guest who kind of blew my mind, suggesting that, oh, yeah, I think we'll have humanoid robots within a decade that are relatively mainstream doing things like cleaning your bathroom for you. Right. And I was like, oh my God, that's 10 years away. That's crazy. I sign me up. And I'm thinking, wow, what are the companies making these things? And will this be some massive new product category, right? Along the lines of an iPhone that in the future, everyone needs to have their phone and they also have a little robot at home, right? You have your car, you have your phone, you have your robot, right? What's your take of that that timeline and that scenario? What types of things do you think robots will be doing for us, and how far away are we from that, and how realistic and plausible is all of that?
So I agree with the other guest's timeline. I think that 10 years is definitely reasonable to see humanoid robotics in the mainstream. We see right now, if you pay attention to the field of robotics, that it's not even an idea anymore. It's here and it's real. We're just mastering a lot of scenarios. Now, I've only been recently impressed with self-driving cars within honestly the last couple of months and some of the capabilities they've had. And they've touted self-driving cars for the last few, almost the last 15 years. Several companies have said, yeah, we're going to have it next year for the last 15 years,
Elon
and it
Musk
hasn't happened.
famously, right, talks
Yeah,
about how this
exactly.
year we're going to have self-driving cars. You can just read a book and you're fine. And he's been saying that every year for like 7 years. I'm exaggerating a bit, but
No, you're
yes.
totally right. I remember in 2016 it was going to be next year, and then every year it's been next year, next year, next year. uh, but to that point, right? Like they self-driving cars are proven almost, well, I mean, in some capacity, 2 decades ago, and now some could argue they're kind of hitting mainstream, or they're becoming more available. Some could argue they're not, or they still got 5 or 6 years left to go. But regardless, robotics is having its moment right now where it's learning to master all of these tasks, right? And I think that when they get deployed, it's not going to look at this humanoid robot does everything that a human can. It's going to be something like this robot has a specific set of tasks, and if I was in charge of those companies, I would enable them to learn tasks on the job, right? So I hope that each robot's going to continue to improve and learn new tasks, so that the robot you buy tomorrow is going to be not as smart as a robot you buy in 5 years, right? Even though it's the same
Hmm.
robot, it's obviously its psychology and its mind is going to learn a lot more. And so I think that and within 10 years, probably within 5, we'll see humanoid robots released in a very narrow scope, but they'll converge more towards like replicating human capabilities within 10.
What's an example or two of things this mainstream humanoid robot might be able to do in 5 years? Like, for instance, cleaning a bathroom. Is that in play? Is like making your bed? What are types of things around the house you think robots might? I know it sounds silly, but this, I guess, the seriousness here is if you're a robotics company, you're having to think, okay, we need actual use cases. What is actually something that's realistic and useful people would want beyond the novelty factor? Beyond, I remember, like, if you remember Rocky 3, I think that Polly had some robot. It's like in
Yeah.
1984, right? Like, oh, this is horrible polyintation. Like, look at the robot, Rocky. And so the robot was kind of like just scooting around, carrying a drink for him. Obviously, it would need to be a little more advanced than that and do things that are actually useful, right? So, what do you envision them actually doing?
Yeah, so to play on that example, I think serving is going to be like actual serving meals, serving plates, etc. That's an easy win, right? We're already seeing good examples of robots doing that now. Maybe not necessarily in a bipedal humanoid form, but on rollers or on wheels, walking throughout the restaurants. I've been personally served by robots at 2 different restaurants recently, but they've been on wheels, and again, very narrowly scoped, but. I think a lot of the mundane chores around the house will be automated by them. So, I mean, anything that will require, like, anything, the easiest ones are going to be things that are really repetitive, right? So, like folding clothes, putting dishes away, right? Like, there's 4 or 5 steps putting dishes. Locate the dish, pick it up. Where does it go? Put it back in the cupboard. Go back to the dishwasher. Pick it up a dish, right? You're cycling that over and over and over again. And there's a lot of dexterity, from a mechanical standpoint about how do we grab dishes and make sure we don't break them. But I think those types of tasks are going to be very automated. I mean, home chores
Mm-hmm.
right
Mm-hmm.
now, Roombas
Mm-hmm.
have automated vacuuming, right, and kind of mopping
Mm-hmm.
to some degree. I mean, there's still some corner cases they need to work out, but those types of chores are automated.
Right.
I think that as the approach more of the industrial level, a lot of like heavy lifting type stuff around the house, like putting all of my Christmas decorations back up in the garage or whatever, that type of stuff, I think will definitely be automated by more of a humanoid form. But it will be interesting to really see what is going to be automated by these humanoid robots and what's going to be automated by more or less non-humanoid machines, right? Like Roomba type stuff or Roomba type robots. I mean, there's Roomba type machines for mowing your lawn now, right? It's like humanoid robots probably don't need to automate that because it's
Right.
just overkill, right? It's just you don't need fingers to mow your lawn if when a different machine can do that already.
And
Um,
there's you really want to be obnoxious to show your neighbors, look at this. I have
yeah,
my Jetsons robot mowing my lawn. Right.
exactly. The one thing I don't think will ever be automated is, which is ironic because we're seeing a lot of automated right now. I don't think eventually we'll ever automate like true art forms. And what I mean by that is, like, I don't want to go watch a football game with a bunch of robots. Like, I want to go
Hmm.
see Tom Brady play. I want to go see, Patrick Mahomes play. I want to go watch Drake sing. I want to go watch LeBron James play. Right? Like, those are artists that sure, I'm sure they'll build a robot that can shoot better than LeBron and that can throw a pass better than Tom Brady could have, or all these things, right? That I mean, music generation is already happening, so I'm sure Drake's not super happy, right? But I want to go have that human connection with another human, and I think that even if robots and AI can't automate certain tasks, as humans, we're still going to want to have that human connection and we're going to prefer humans to do tasks over certain robots.
Let's cover now kind of tailwinds and headwinds to get to that reality of mainstream robots. On the tailwind side, I'm going to give a shout out to a friend of the pod, Jamie Davis. We were discussing this recently, and he had an interesting point that, when you mentioned all the corner cases of self-driving cars, and even if it's, let's say, not 90%, even if they get 99%, even 99.9% of what humans can do, the stakes of self-driving cars are so effing high, right? Because if one time out of 10,000 or even 100,000 miles, if they make some mistake and kill a little toddler or whatever, then that sets the industry back 5 years. I'm exaggerating in every way, but you get what I'm saying, right? The stakes are high. It's literally life and death. But in the case of mainstream humanoid robots that are doing things like putting dishes away or making you an omelet, like, let's say it gets to 99.9% and there's still some corner cases. If it messes up, oh no, you break a dish. Oh no, literally broke an egg. And like, yeah, that might lead to some customer complaints and you might have to, but that's normal business stuff at that point, right? It's a long-winded way of saying, is it possible that because the stakes of like consumer household chores robots are so much lower and less life and death, and also, as you pointed out, Kordel, you can have narrower scopes, right? You don't have to say drive around the world. It can be like, no, dude, just put my dishes away. Like, because of the stakes are lower and the scope is narrower, that might be a tailwind to this developing faster than folks realize, and really might make it get into homes sooner than people are expecting.
Yeah, I fully agree, Jeff. I think that the barriers to entry for a lot of the consumer tasks are much lower because the consequences of failure are much lower. If you look at other industries, right, transportation, self-driving cars, as you mentioned, is one of them. Healthcare is another industry. The consequences of AI or a robot being wrong, I mean, are incredible. I mean, if one consequence is somebody dies, right, that is an extremely sobering. It makes the problem much more sobering and much more harder to attain. And that's why I think that we've seen a lot more innovation in the consumer industry for AI and robotics than in more regulated industries like healthcare or transportation, because there is, there's a consensus that these things do need to cover 99.69% of cases before we're ever going to trust them. I mean, AI has been used in social media for, I mean, years, and not a lot of people know it. But if your Instagram auto captioning tool doesn't correctly tag your friend, right, by using facial recognition or image recognition, it doesn't ruin your day. It's annoying, right? But it doesn't ruin your day, right? But it's much different if for example, chest X-ray of is fed into an AI model and it misclassifies, lung cancer versus non-lung cancer, right? If that's wrong, that's incredibly impactful for a human. So it's tough because, well, at some point you have to ask, we don't want this disparity between regulated industries and non-regulated industries. Like, we don't want consumer tech to be so far ahead of regulated industries that regulated industries are not able to benefit from the advancements of AI and robotics. But there needs to be some balance there, right? Like, I won't say there need to be more risk taking in healthcare, but there needs to be more, I feel like, more entrepreneurial activity to try to build more transparency and explainability into these AI models and robotics.
Totally agree. So that's kind of the tailwind case of how this could be spurred and help get mainstream. On the headwinds front, you mentioned earlier that hardware is a lot more complicated, or can be a lot more complicated than software. So many more variables, right? So, what are some of the biggest obstacles and tech challenges to getting these humanoid robots that can make me my omelets each morning and then clean the dishes and do my laundry for me?
One of the biggest challenges I see, besides hardware, is like sensor fusion, right? So how do we do multimodal learning? We've got AI and we've got robots that are really good with vision, right? We got some that are really good at sound recognition. We've got some that are really good at manipulating objects with hands, that dexterity. But when you have to combine all of that together to complete a task, that's where things get really difficult. And I think that we're at the reality now where that's a primary focus for researchers and companies, is to figure out how do we merge all this intelligence and all of these sensors together into a single cohesive understanding, situational awareness, that it's actually able to complete a task, right? And that it can handle different corner cases. It can handle, if the glass breaks, okay, what happens if a robot's, putting away the dishes? Well, what happens? How do I handle that? Do I clean up the glass, or do I continue putting away dishes, or what's my next step? So handling contingencies in a dynamic world, but also making sure that we can fuse all these different sensing modalities together, I think is not necessarily a headwind, but it's a frontier right now that I think we have to solve before we can actually actualize humanoid robots.
Two of the biggest challenges facing Gen AI that I'm aware of that's frequently in the media are the challenge of not enough chips given the processing power that AI requires, and then secondly, having enough data, the data sets that are feeding these LLMs. So I'm curious, are those constraints also present on the robotics and hardware side? Or if not, what's the robot hardware version of those constraints?
So there's with AI, there's always this mentality that there's going to be a bigger model. There's going to be a more you can build a more mature algorithm. You can add more compute power. You can throw more data at it, and that's true to some degree, right? There are some scaling laws there that prevent you from just making things bigger and bigger and bigger, and to when those returns start to diminish. But I think that the chip shortage now, or the chip constraint, is forcing roboticists and engineers to consider how to make more with less, right? So, how do I use last year's processor on a smaller machine learning model? How do I train this robot to learn a task without the most cutting edge processor? Is it a software problem? Is it a hardware problem? And how do I do so with less data? I mean, there's a plethora of image recognition data sets online. You can teach an image recognition model, right? But how do you teach a robot to do some of these comprehensive tasks from end to end, to the point where I say, okay, go put away all my dishes, come back to me when you're done? You can't. I mean, to some degree, it has to be dynamic thinking. You can't just throw a bunch of training data at that and have it solve the problem. There has to be some intelligence in there that can learn from minimal data. And that is something that we have to learn. We are learning to handle, and we are learning to solve, is not necessarily throwing more data at the problem, but how do we learn more with less data, and how do we do so with less compute power, right? We can't always scale up. I mean, we can, but in theory, it's going to take it. There's a constraint on it, right? I mean, Moore's law follows in theory, but in actuality, with manufacturing, it might be not quite as prolific as it has been the last few years, because we actually have to address the chip shortage before we can continue Moore's law.
You mentioned multi-sensor and multi-sensory input earlier. That brings us to smell. I think a lot of people, when they think robots and sensors, first thing they imagine, myself included, is vision and the robot seeing things. Um, Talk about why smell is important and what problems you guys are trying to solve and what you're building.
Sure. So yeah, to your point, smell's not something that folks really think about when they think about robotics, right? We have really good replicators of all human senses. We have vision, we have hearing, so vision through cameras, hearing through microphones, speakers, right, for a mouth. We have dexterity sensors for touching things, but we don't really have a mainstream use for some of these electronic noses, right? Like what is the form factor for that? So my company, Theta Diagnostics, is maturing the electronic nose sensors so that we can use that with AI. And there's a plethora of different use cases for it. But from an AI and robotics perspective, one thing that is interesting to me is, or that we kind of collectively at Theta agree upon, is that if we want to develop full artificial general intelligence, you have to have all five senses and you have to have a body that can move about the world. So if again, I'm assuming my definition of AGI, because there are several, is human level intelligence or beyond. And I don't think that something can have human level intelligence if it doesn't have a personified body, it doesn't have all five senses, and it hasn't experienced the world in that way. So, I mean, as an example, if you were to go to France, right, and you're sitting in a cafe eating a French baguette and you're drinking coffee and the Eiffel Tower's out the window, you could probably argue that you're missing some of the experience if you don't have the sense of smell, right? You can't smell
Hmm.
what's going on in the bakery. You can't smell the aroma of flowers in the background. You're missing you're missing an aspect of that experience. And so I think it would be a little bit foolish, naive of humans to try to say we're at AGI if we skip a few senses, right? We're at human level AGI if we skip those senses.
Especially since, as I understand it, memory is so indelibly linked to smell. Talk about that and how there is this potential link between smell and memory. So, as we're trying to somehow concoct AGI, and we have these brilliant scientists, yourself included, all racing to try and build AGI, maybe is useful in that stew, in this cauldron of, of models and LLMs, to have this link between memory and smell.
So yeah, that's it's you allude to a really interesting point with multimodal learning. What we've discovered, and we aren't the first to discover it. Any entity or any organization, research institute doing merging multiple sensors together has already sympathized with this. But as we merged our sensors with our electronic nose sensors with, for example, cameras, we're able to get a lot better understanding about the smell itself. So if I use these sensors to just smell a compound, right, a chemical compound, then it gets a certain understanding. But if I start using it vision with it, and I start using other sensing modalities, it has that memory bind, if you will, that you were just mentioning. That we call it sensor fusion. That creates a
Hmm.
much larger understanding at a higher dimensional space that facilitates more accurate detection. And so that's interesting, right? Because uh, there's aspects of brain damage in humans that if you receive damage to one part of your like one part of your brain that disables, for example, hearing, then there's evidence to suggest that those parts of your brain can allocate resources to vision. So you now have hypersensitive vision, right? And vice versa. And we notice the same thing with machine learning, that if we add more modalities to a problem, we get more advanced awareness, and we get better sensing accuracy. And then if we fuse those sensing modalities together for a while, and then we remove one, it's not like the removed sensing modality kills the accuracy of the one that still exists. That those two have trained together for so long that it's built up this memory, this multimodal embedding space that allows the enabled sensor to continue to be more accurate. And so it's a really interesting influence between neuroscience and AI that, to your point, allows this memory to form between multiple sensing modalities and complements how humans can do so much between all of our sensing modalities.
That's so interesting. All right, now let's have a little fun. Let's imagine that we get to a point where you've done it. You and your team have cracked the code. We got smell as part of the mix figured out. Maybe even we have AGI or AGI ish figured out, and it's now in robots. So we have robots with some element of AGI there, right? And we could all agree these are actual robots. Talk about when you see that happening. I know no one's a crystal ball and no one's going to come back to you and say, wait, Kordel, you said this year, it's not here yet. But when do you see it happening? And then how will the average person be impacted? How will it actually change the world when we get to that point? What are some ways the world will look differently?
Man, there are several aspects of that. So there's several levels of the question I have to address. And the first one is, if we look at just a pure intelligence level, no emotion, I think we will honestly be there within the next 10 years, dare I say five. where we have a human level intelligence, right? Just pure logic, not including emotion. Now, I think that, well, there are already companies working on this. Whether we believe in it or not, I think that emotions are going to be programmed into machines, and they're going to learn to recognize them, and they're going to exhibit them as well. We're going to have our humanoid robots have maybe a higher humor level than my neighbor's humanoid robot, right? Because maybe I like to joke
Hmm.
around or a little bit more, something like that. So we're going to have more of these human interactions. Now, I'm of the philosophy that if we start to build an intelligence that replicates humans, and we build it to perform all of human capabilities, we start building emotion into it, we start building all these things, we're going to establish a new culture in which robotics and humans have to live together, work together, obviously, but that they start to almost establish rights. So instead of me slamming the door in my car because I'm angry and my car shut down or I have a flat tire, right? And I'm pissed that happened. I might not be able to do that to a robot in the future, because I think that there will inevitably be rights that say, "Hey, we've built this thing to be a machine form of a human. Now we need to treat it like one." And I know that's a little maybe awkward or maybe too forward thinking to say, but if it walks like a duck and acts like a duck, it's probably a duck. You extrapolate that philosophy out to robotics. At what point do we just reinvent a human, but with actuators and servos instead of a gooey mushy brain?
And this brings us full circle to the data from Star Trek scenario, right? I think you're also, I agree. I think I'm happy to make that prediction. I think that will happen in our lifetime, that we will have a data from Star Trek looking robot that, yes, philosophers and neuroscientists can debate, is that real sentience or is it fake sentience? Is it a real emotion or fake emotion? And these get to kind of very deep philosophical questions that people have been debating for literally millennia, since well before Aristotle. And we're not going to solve it on a podcast or in our lifetime, right? But I think that the fact that these questions will still exist doesn't mean that we're not going to be confronted with a scenario of you have this really good robot that makes jokes, and when you insult it and yell at it, it looks sad and kind of makes puppy eyes at you. You're like, shit, I feel
Exactly.
bad chewing out my robot.
Artificial sentience. I like that. You just coined that term, right? There's AI, artificial intelligence, and then there's AGI, but there's artificial sentience, right? That will be the differentiator between, full blown AGI with emotions, etc., and just humans.
I love that. I love that. We're making it happen here. So I had a guest on a podcast earlier, Professor Sabo from NYU, is a philosopher whose his main point is that these robots are coming and they should be afforded dignity, right? If we are in the same way we think a pet or a dog deserves dignity and we shouldn't allow it to be just beaten up or cruel to. Um, if these robots exhibit all the same qualities of humans, as uncomfortable as it is, we should treat them with some respect. How are you thinking about? I know lots to unpack here also as we're winding down, but briefly, how are you thinking about the ethical and kind of sci-fi consequences therein, and even the risk to humanity, right? If okay, we build these robots. I know it sounds like we're entering Terminator 2 territory here. Of oh, we got the robots and they're super smart, and what if they want to vanquish all the humans, right? Or if we can clone, if we have this infinite clones of robots. Generally, how are you? Where's your mind go? How are you thinking about these wild questions that we'll be confronted with down the road?
It's definitely at the front of my mind. One thing that gives me comfort is that I do see a lot of activity in the ethics space, and I do see that um, I see a lot of these big tech companies trying to understand the impact that they're making, right? And trying to do, some of them, I won't say all of them, but some of them I feel like are trying to do deep studies on how current AI behaves, because we still don't know, right? These things are black boxes. There's ways to figure out exactly how they behave, but with math, but they still have these emergent behaviors that we don't understand. And I take comfort in the fact that I think a lot of people out there are being proactive on how to handle it. Um, I think that there's not going to be like a day where we wake up, right? And then it's like AGI's here and they want to take over the world. There's going to be a gradual increase. And I think that we need to make sure that we're taking the right steps now to understand what happens when we get there and how can we limit the bad things that happen, right? Like where's the kill switch on all this? At what point do we give robots their own agenda to the point where they're like, okay, I'm done with all my tasks now. Do I shut down or do I go find something else, right? Like at what point do we limit access to certain things on the internet so it can't learn on its own? You know, all these checks and balances that we need to put into robotics and AI. I don't think anyone has the right answer to it yet because it's come so quickly that it's like shit, we're here. But I do see that there are the necessary steps being taken, and from our perspective with Theta, we're trying to make sure that we're focused on building, you know, the sense of smell into machines. And so the way that we're limiting the use cases there is we're just trying to limit to who can access it, right? Like maybe we don't want to have certain companies access it because they're using it in a bad way. And we'll get to what that might be on in this forum, but we are trying to make sure that we also approach things from a sobering perspective to ensure that you know, we aren't contributors to a bad AI.
Can you briefly describe what your testing with smell and robots actually looks like? Do you have like, okay, here's some rotted cheese, here's a piece of delicious cherry pie, and then linking this smell to other concepts? So what are things you're actually doing with smell when it comes to these machines?
Sure. So we look for a particular set of chemical compounds called volatile organic compounds. And that's a big chemistry word that really just means we're looking for smells that basically off gas from substances that are out in the environment. So our original intent with these sensors was to put these sensors on a drone and have them track a scent like a hound tracks a scent when it's searching for
Hmm.
food or going through the woods. And so, like, if you're trying to find asbestos in a building, right? Or if you're trying to find, you know, different, for example, you want to locate explosives within a building for, you know, potential bad actor. We were trying to help address that scenario, right? It's basically it's building the digital version of the dog tracking a scent. However, we found a lot of lift, and we pivoted the company completely around building the device for looking at chemicals on the human breath. Because the human breath, there are thousands of chemicals in there that give an indication of what's going on in your body. It's like a blueprint for how your body feels. And so we're
Hmm.
able to detect various chemicals. They're called biomarkers that can, for example, indicate pneumonia, COVID. We're going through a clinical trial right now for the detection of lung cancer on a patient's breath. So being able to use that sense of smell in novel ways that are pretty just benign, right? Through just a device that you hold in the palm of your hand and you breathe into. I mean, that's not next level AI, but it could contribute. You know, if you were to take those same sensors and you put them on these humanoid robots, you can, you know, you've now enabled the sense of smell. So we're trying to take these benign scenarios and really perfect the sensors and make sure that they can ace these really rudimentary use cases, albeit very impactful, before we, you know, try to actually integrate them into the robots.
Awesome. Exciting stuff, man. I really appreciate you taking the time, Cordell. Really enjoyed it. Exciting to see where this shakes out. And thanks again for coming on.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jeff. I appreciate it. Thank you for your audience.
There you have it. Thanks again to Kordel France, founder and lead engineer of Theta. And thank you to you, listeners, humans or robots, whoever you are. I do not discriminate. I am happy for your listeners. Thank you, my robot friends. So whether you're a human or robot, please subscribe, give it 5 stars, and send it to more of your robot friends, or even your old-fashioned flesh and blood meat bag human friends. Thanks again, and see you next time.